Hello, Father John. Happy Easter from all the St. Ignatius Parish community to you, and lots of love. Hope that you are going well with the lockdown, but I also hope that if you followed through the celebrations, you have been able to enter deeply into them, and also today to come deeply into the last part of the three parts of Easter, the Last Supper, the death, and the resurrection. The death, the suffering, and the pain of Jesus and our world is over, and we begin the Easter story where we have two things. One is an empty tomb, and the other is myriad stories of Jesus appearing and the disciples coming to the belief that it is not over. In fact, it has barely just begun. There are all sorts of resurrection stories. Mary Magdalene, which we hear today, the disciples in the upper room, the disciples on the road to Emmaus, sitting at a meal, going fishing. There are many, and you cannot just join them together and connect all the dots. They stand as a myriad witness to the early church's belief in the resurrection. And aside from the fact that Jesus was crucified, the rising of the church and the experience of the resurrection, which brought these people who denied and abandoned Jesus coming together, is the other historical event that we can know for sure. So what is it? Let's have a look at the first reading for the Mass today. And it's very simply Peter, who had betrayed Jesus, is now talking about him and the good news about him to no less than a Roman centurion, obviously an officer of the empire like Pontius Pilate, and telling him the good news of Jesus risen and saying, "We are witnesses to this." Exactly what the this is beyond words, and yet Peter is preaching it. If we come to the Gospel, we find Mary Magdalene mentioned in the beginning, and then Peter and the disciple Jesus loved coming to the tomb, and then they go home. I think what has happened is that those who put the book of readings together have omitted the most important part, which is the following on story of Mary Magdalene's encounter with the risen Jesus. The little blip in the middle, put it down to the sexist readings of the people who put the Bible together. The real thing is Mary's story, and it goes on. She's at the empty tomb, and she hears a voice, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She turns around, doesn't recognize him, thinks he's the gardener, and then suddenly he calls her by her name, Mary. It's in that moment that for her everything changes. It's not over. He's here. The man I love is with me. She throws her arms around him, and then after that encounter, he gives her a job. He says, "Go back to the disciples and tell them." And so she goes back to the disciples and says, "I have seen the Lord." This is probably one of the most explicit stories of the resurrection. And like Mary Magdalene, she and the other women are always the first witnesses to the resurrection. So what does it mean for us? The resurrection experience is something that is impossible to put into words. It's an experience of the impossibly great God, the God beyond all names and all experiences. It is the fact that in this Jesus who has come, who has been with us, who has brought us a kingdom, and then who has been brutally suffered and died, and we are invited at that point to enter into the symbolic place which is the death of Jesus and come through it despite all our sufferings with love. Here, as it were, we come through the other side with love and into a different space. It is a space now that we don't create for ourselves, but it is a space of the experience that despite everything and despite all our efforts, we are loved and accepted for who we are. It's a love that embraces not only us, but it embraces all peoples, calling us into community. It embraces our whole planet. Think of the blue planet picture taken by the astronaut, and it embraces all sorts of aspects. And so for us, it may be difficult to believe in the risen Jesus, but our community of faith will tell us, and it tells us and tells you that there it opens up the space for a new vision of life, a hope-filled and love-filled vision. It invites us not to just believe in a passive way, but to enter proactively into a vision of a new world and a new creation with the risen Jesus at its centre. As he identified with every aspect of our suffering and of our world, everywhere we meet, everywhere we look, we can see him and encounter the graced presence that he brings to us. For us, the final experience, and maybe the only one, is the moment of our death, when we will have the true resurrection experience. But for us now, maybe this time of lockdown can be a little more than being locked down. It can be like a graced moment where we experience the loving presence of God, bringing healing and hope and transformation into our lives, that we might love one another a little more deeply and carefully. And I know this is hard because many people now are losing their jobs and so on, but we can continue to love, and it might allow in this time of reflection to look at our world and see how we are going to go into it changed, and how we can help enter into our world and change it with the joyous hope and love of God given to us in the risen Jesus.